Good evening, and welcome to the American Jewish Historical Society. I'm Tamar Zefrin, Director of Archival Partnerships at HHS. We are honored to be hosting tonight's event, Lessons from Henrietta Szold's Legacy, author Francine Klagsbrun, in conversation with Felicia Herman, along with the Natan Fund, Hadassah, and the Jewish Book Council. We have added applause breaks after each paragraph of the remarks. There are so many wonderful people to thank and include. Peggy Moss, Region President for the Hadassah Metro Area, and Shayna Engler, leader of the Metro Hadassah Evolve community, are both in attendance and will be thrilled to discuss more about Hadassah with you after our evening's program. This conversation will include a brief Q&A near the end of the discussion. Please write down any questions you may wish to ask our guests on the note cards you received at check-in. If you do not have a note card, please raise your hand and an HHS staff member will come and bring one to you before the Q&A portion arrives. You will be prompted by our wonderful moderator when it is time to hand your note cards to HHS staff, who will collect them from you and deliver them to our moderator. And now I would like to welcome Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, who will introduce our guests for this evening. Thank you.
Hi all, thank you very much for being here tonight. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen and I chair the Natan Notable Books Committee of the Natan Fund. The Natan Fund is a giving circle where members pull their charitable contributions together and make joint decisions about how best to support Jewish and Israeli social innovation. Most of our work is focused on funding early-stage Jewish and Israeli nonprofits, but we also have the distinct pleasure of giving out a book award twice a year, and we are delighted to have selected Francine Klagsbrun's Henrietta Szold, Hadassah, and the Zionist Dream as our most recent selection. It is particularly resonant for Natan to honor a book about Henrietta Szold, a woman who catalyzed tremendous change by identifying the needs of her communities and devoting herself fully to bringing these ideas to fruition. Szold is most closely identified with the creation of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist organization, but Klagsbrun's biography reminds us that Szold also established the first English language night school for immigrants in Baltimore, brought crucial medical care and social services to British Mandate Palestine, and led the Youth Aliyah, saving thousands of Jewish children from the clutches of Nazi Germany. Szold set her eyes on the future, a clarion call for us all. Natan is also privileged to recognize Francine Klagsbrun, who herself has had tremendous impact on the story of American Jewish women and has written a compelling, nuanced biography of a woman we would all do well to remember. Francine is the author of more than a dozen books, including Lioness, Golda Meir, and the Nation of Israel, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2017. I would describe her as the Forrest Gump of American Jewish feminism, but that would imply a passive bystander, and Francine has been an integral force. She edited the first Ms. Reader in 1973, Free to Be You and Me, in 1974, one of my childhood favorites. In 1978, she was one of 3 women and 11 men appointed by the Chancellor of JTS to a special commission to study the issue of ordaining women as rabbis, which they ultimately did in 1983. And fun fact, Francine was the first woman to carry a Torah at the Western Wall, selected as part of the first International Jewish Feminist Conference in Jerusalem in 1988. Francine and her beloved husband, Sam, who passed away 1 year ago, were also founders of Congregation Or Zarua on the Upper East Side. She's been a columnist for the New York Jewish Week, and Moment is a contributing editor to Lilith and on the editorial board of the Hadassah magazine. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Newsweek, Ms. Magazine, and many others. We're thrilled to hear Francine in conversation with Felicia Herman. Felicia led Natan as executive director for 16 years, and is now Managing Director North America of the Maimonides Fund and Associate Editor of Sapir, Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future. During COVID, she also served as the Director of the Aligned Grant Program of the Jewish Community Response and Impact Fund. Felicia sits on the boards of the American Jewish Historical Society, Dream Street Theater Company, and Natan, as well as on the advisory boards of 2 initiatives launched by Natan, Shomer Collective and Amplifier, both of which she founded. Felicia holds a PhD in Jewish history and an MA in Jewish Women's Studies from Brandeis University, and she is a proud recipient of the Jewish Funders Network, J.J. Greenberg Memorial Award. I'm a huge fan of both of these women, and it's my honor to introduce them both. Enjoy.
Should we have them turn the lights down a little? I think we could perform surgery up here. It's so bright. So maybe if you could turn the stage lights down a little. Thank you. That's nice. Okay, great. How wonderful is this? So thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Tali. And thanks to everyone for being here. And really thank you, Francine, for this marvelous gem of a book. I can only imagine actually how difficult it was to condense Henrietta Szold's unbelievably rich and long life into a book this short. But this, we should mention, is part of the Yale Jewish Lives series. So it holds its place on a bookshelf along with incredible Jewish lives from pretty much from the Bible to the present, I think, right? So it's very, very special to have Henrietta there. And indeed, you yourself have lived an extraordinary life, which we're going to talk about a little bit before we get to the Q&A. But this is really a very special opportunity. I was so proud to be part of the book award committee that chose this book, because we are really living at a time when we need role models, we need heroes. I think a lot about the many, many differences between our lives and the lives of Israelis right now. Of course, they are going through tremendous tragedy, and they also are constantly telling the stories of their heroes. Unfortunately, a lot of those heroes are people who are losing their lives, but they are like immersed in stories of role models and heroes and ideas about who they want to be in the world. And I feel like American Jews, especially after October 7th, but always need to know our own heroes, and we need to know who, what qualities of character and habits of mind that we want to emulate here today. Henrietta Szold, I think about, we're going to talk about her life in depth, but as someone who's been involved in Jewish philanthropy for over 20 years, I think Henrietta Szold is a kind of person we are always looking for. She is dedicated, passionate, she's so well educated, she loves the Jewish people, and she's an incredible administrator. I think she thinks of herself as kind of inferior because she's only, good at administration, and she thinks of herself not as creative. But this is an incredible skill that changes the world, being a good administrator. And she's compassionate, but she's also very strong-willed. One of my favorite quotes from the book that you bring from her is that she says she has a big capacity for righteous indignation, which I think is something we can both empathize with. Henrietta lived an incredibly long life. She was born in 1860, so a year before the Civil War started, and she died in 1945. So as World War II was coming to an end, just think about the ferment and the change in that period. And she was right in the center of so many things that we know are essential to Jewish life today. There in America, as the reform movement is really emerging, and then as the conservative movement comes into being sort of in reaction, or as a middle ground between reform and orthodoxy, she's right in the center of that. She's right in the center of the creation of American Zionism, and is an early Zionist, like public Zionist, even before Theodor Herzl, right? Well, maybe we'll talk about that. And she is one of the people who built up the land of Israel. It's just extraordinary. She knew everyone. Think of a person, a Jewish leader from that time, and she knew them, and they respected her so much so that it actually feels like a tragedy that she's not more well respected or more well known today. So that's what we're going to remedy tonight. We're going to start to tell the story of Henrietta Szold. So we have an amazing Jewish woman telling us a story of another amazing Jewish woman to inspire all of us to be the heroes, role models, and leaders that we need for our time. So should we get into it?
And I'm ready. Thank you so much. I do want to thank Tamara and Tali and everybody who's here, and of course Felicia. And I am so pleased, not only for myself, but really for Henrietta Szold, because she did such incredible things. She was so well known in her day, and somehow, maybe this happens mostly to women, but also to men. She's been largely forgotten, certainly here in the United States. She's still known in Israel, but it's so nice to bring her back to life here and with this group that cares.
Okay, so let's do it. So let's start at the beginning. She's born in 1860 in Baltimore.
Right.
Now I know, Tali, why we chose the book, Baltimore connection. She's born in Baltimore. She has an incredible family. Tell us about her childhood, her relationship to her father, and how her youth really set her up for what she was going to do the rest of her life.
She was the eldest of 5 living daughters. 3 of them died in infancy. Her father was Rabbi Benjamin Szold, a very brilliant scholar and rabbi. And she was the eldest, and I guess to his mind, she was certainly the most intellectual. And he raised her sort of on his knees, studying with him the way he might have raised an eldest son to train him for the rabbinate. And she studied everything with him. She learned Talmud. She learned Bible. She learned to speak language, English and French and German. And as time went on, she began to help him. He was working on a book of Job, and she helped him with that. He saw how intellectually astute she was and kept teaching her. It was wonderful for her, really great. She learned everything and she knew everything. On the other hand, it was also in some ways confining. She was so adored that father. He remained an influence in her life long after he died. She would quote him, even in her very old age, she would quote him daily. And in some ways, as she was growing up, her sisters got married and had families. She was dedicated to her father, to helping him, and then to the family as a whole. So it was a wonderful thing for her, and in some ways, it exploited her also at the same time.
And they traveled to Europe.
They traveled to Europe to meet her parents both came from Hungary, but they traveled to meet both sides of the family there. And they did, they got to meet them all. And she had a wonderful time. One of the cousins took her around, showed her everything, and said, if you would stay a little longer, if you would stay several more months, I'll take you to Italy later. But her father said, the young people, the young children want you home, expect you home. So she went off with him back home. But she learned about Europe in that period of time. She learned there was a broader world in Baltimore, and she learned a lot about that at the same time.
So they went to Europe in 1881,
right.
Before, just on the cusp of when mass immigration from Eastern Europe started to the United States. Then they come back to the United States. And tell us about her interactions with Eastern European immigrants, and especially what made her and her family's relationship to those immigrants different from the standard kind of relationship that Central European Jews had.
Well, so many of the people in Baltimore, and as in the United States, the Jews were what were called German Jews, those Jews who came from Central Europe earlier. And they were kind of getting to be assimilated. They were holding larger positions. And they were, many of them actually wedded to Reform Judaism, which was developing at this time. And, they were attending, not wearing hats in synagogue. They were celebrating Christmas. They were attending temples rather than shuls. And then all comes these Eastern European Jews, which were now known as Russian Jews. They came from, all of Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Poland, and so on, but they became known as the Russian Jews. And this was not only in Baltimore. They went to mostly the large cities in New York and San Francisco and so on, but thousands of them also came to Baltimore. And the German Jews were a little bit embarrassed by these sort of Jews. They didn't speak German. They spoke Yiddish, which was a corruption of German in their minds. And they, they weren't dressed the way they were. Many of them were poor. And they kind of looked down on them. They created institutions for them to help them get acculturated to the United States, but they weren't exactly mingling with them. But Henrietta and her father saw something different. They saw that these Jews from Eastern Europe were very Jewishly knowledgeable. very caring about that and caring about this history. They didn't call it Zionism at that time, but nationalism, the history of their people. And they befriended these Jews and really got to know a group of them, particularly who ran a literary society. They began giving lectures to that society and learned from them. For Henrietta particularly, she learned for the first time about Zionism. As she said, Zionism converted me to itself. She was so taken when she learned from them about the earliest pioneers who were now going to the land of Israel. They were called Chovavei Zion, lovers of Zion, beginning to build the first settlements there. And these Russian Jews knew about them and talked about them, and she thought that was a terrific thing. So she was very taken with them from that point of view, very taken with them because she knew that they had to get used to living in America just the way the German Jews had. So she began a night school of teaching them English and teaching them to learn how to acculturate into the United States. Her night school of teaching the Russian Jews English became a model for night schools throughout the country, not only for Jews, but throughout the country, of teaching new immigrants. We have a lot of negative stuff about immigrants these days. In those days, they were teaching immigrants how to get used to this country and how to speak the language. And she created this, was a model for this later years. Fiorello LaGuardia said, had it not been for her school, he himself would not have learned how to develop and how to become mayor of New York City. So she did an incredible thing with that night school.
LaGuardia gave her the key to the city of New York.
He gave her the keys to New York, exactly.
Yeah. And
for
so,
those young people who don't know, he was the mayor of New York when I was
everyone's
growing
heard of
up.
the airport, so. There's so much to say about this period with the immigrants and how they changed American Judaism as well, because they really offered a bolster. If the German Jews were sort of leaning towards reform, the Eastern European Jews came and sort of pushed things back to the center, at least
Well,
for
most of our relatives and great-grandparents and grandparents and parents came from Eastern Europe.
But I think what was so beautiful about her life and what then led to the way that they treated the immigrants and then her love for Zionism is that it came from such a deep learning about Jewish history, Jewish texts, the Jewish people. She didn't just love the Jewish people who she agreed with, right? Like she just loved the Jewish people. And so tell us how that led to Zionism and how her Zionism was different than the political Zionism of Herzl and Ben Gurion that we're used to.
First of all, she started writing articles at a very young age, right out of high school, and was already beginning to write about the Jewish people and what the Jewish people should be doing and not doing, like not celebrating Christmas. But she was very taken, as we said, with Zionism. Her father had taught her that Judaism was not just a creed or a religion, but that it's a total way of life. And as she saw it, if Judaism is a way of life, there also this homeland for the Jewish people completes that. That completes the circle. That is what Judaism is about. Jews are not just a religion, they are a people. And as a people, they need a land and a homeland. And she really cultivated that idea and believed it. Now, her way of looking at Zionism and the land of Israel was different than Herzl, who came, as she said, she spoke about Zionism before Herzl. It was a different kind of Zionism. It was what became known as cultural Zionism. And she didn't develop it. It was really developed by a writer named Echad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, who wrote essays. But she took it in a slightly different direction. The idea was everybody didn't have to live in that land. In fact, as far as Echad Ha'am was concerned, the Jews in the diaspora were so beaten down, they weren't up to living in this land yet and cultivating the land. But there could be a cultural center there. And she picked up that idea. She felt many people could live there. She wasn't so exclusive. But that Palestine, at that time they called it Palestine, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, could be a cultural center for Jews, from which would emanate culture, poetry, writing, ways of living that would then develop and uplift the diaspora Jews. So she saw it, well, we'll get to Hadassah in a few moments, but you didn't have to live there, but you needed to support it so that it could develop that center and it could become an inspiration for Jews throughout the diaspora. And that became known as cultural Zionism. Theodor Herzl developed what is known and became, the way Israel was formed, political Zionism, which was that the Jews, on Herzl's point of view, and she would agree with that to some extent, the Jews were, and he saw the Jews as so persecuted. Herzl was a Jew who grew up with no Jewish background at all, totally secular, an Austrian Jew, but he recognized the tremendous anti-Semitism that was taking place in Europe, particularly with the Dreyfus affair in France. And he said, the only way the Jews would really survive as a people and should survive is to have a land of their own. And once they had a land of his own, Herzl felt there would not be any more anti-Semitism. Well, we've seen that hasn't exactly happened, but that was his point of view. So it had to be a state of their own and a state for Jews, where she spoke of it as a cultural center for culture emanating for Jews throughout the world from there.
So at this point in her life, she was teaching for many years. She started the night school, and then she also became what they called the secretary at the Jewish Publication Society, the brand new Jewish Publication Society. And I asked them to pull from the library one of the many things that she worked on. So one of the things that the Jewish Publication Society was known for was publishing the American Jewish Yearbook. So she, in the first years of the American Jewish Yearbook, basically created the entire thing. And this was on top of all of the books that she was working on, editing, translating. She never slept, as far as we can tell. She never got married. We'll talk about that in a second. But she devoted her life to scholarship, to the Jewish people in a way that I don't think I've ever seen the parallel of that. This is full of the American Jewish Yearbook. I mean, this alone, like Dayenu, the American Jewish Yearbook is full of descriptions of every Jewish organization in America at the time. This one is 1907. And this is, of course, before email or computers or even really phone books. Right. So how did she get all of this information by mail?
She said it was a chore. I mean, one thing about her, she did not complain. I mean, she did complain about it, but she did it anyway. She gave up her vacations to do this. It was a tremendous chore. And she wrote articles, long articles that were also published in the yearbook. She just felt it had to be done, and she did it. And there was just one more thing that she felt had to be done, and there it was. And it was a tremendously important thing, part of Jewish culture. At the Publication Society, yes, she said she was cool. I made a thing about that. In every other publishing house, people who acquire manuscripts, edit manuscripts, work with the authors, publicize the manuscripts and so on, or the books that are written, are called editors or editors-in-chief. She was called secretary because she was the woman in charge. Every job she had seemed to be for a long time. She was called secretary. It really annoyed me so much that I kept calling attention to this in the book. So she was but it didn't bother her. She was the secretary of the Jewish Publication Society, but she acquired the books and she edited them, and she worked very closely with the authors. She did get to know a lot of well-known authors that way, who became well-known authors, and that was good for her, and that's how she got to know everybody who was anybody, as you said. But it was very hard work, and she did it, and she did it. It was the first time, she had lived at home until she was 33 years old, and then she got this position. Home was Baltimore. The society was in Philadelphia, and that was the first time that she moved away from home, and very difficult for her. But she lived with the family who her sister had married into this family, and she lived with family friends, so it wasn't so, you know, so totally different. But that was, to me, interesting, too, that she was 33 before she was able to go off on, or went off on her own, and now work with her father.
So she's an unbelievably resilient woman as well. And resilience, of course, means not just strength, but bouncing back from tragedy. One of the big tragedies of her early life is her father dies in 1902. And how does she respond to that?
Well, at first she was extremely depressed, but then she came to the realization that what would be good for her and good for him was to publish his works. He had written a lot of works, a lot of things. He had done this commentary on the book of Job, but he had other things. If she could get them published, or finish editing them and publish them, that would be a great tribute to him, and it really would help her also. But she felt that she wasn't knowledgeable. She, believe me, she was very, well, one thing I would like to point out, she never went to college, and that was something that she was always self-conscious about. She didn't go to college because there wasn't family money at the time, but also she felt this great responsibility to her family, and she then worked and helped put her sisters through college. But she felt she wasn't knowledgeable enough to really publish her father's works. So she needed to study more and more Jewish, get more Jewish knowledge. And she decided to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which at that time was known as Schechter Seminary, because Solomon Schechter was the head of it and running it all. And they knew that she knew the Schechters, the family knew the Schechters. And so she got permission to study at the seminary on condition that she not pursue a degree as a rabbi, which always also was sort of amusing because the seminary never even took up the subject of women rabbis for another 70 years. But she agreed to that condition because she had no interest in becoming a rabbi.
Well, I love also that you were part of the commission that helped to argue that the conservative movement should ordain rabbis.
Yeah,
so it's a nice,
70 years later.
Yeah, it's a nice circle
Yeah,
there.
I feel like I worked at Jewish I didn't work, but I was on the publication committee of the Jewish Publication Society. I think it was the 1980s, I'm not sure. And there were no other women on that at that time. Wow. There's a picture in their history book of all these men and me. I sort of relate to Henrietta in that way.
And Golda Meir.
Yeah. But anyway, so she then decides to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
And what happens to her there?
Well, first of all, she gets to know all the professors. She helps them because while they're brilliant and great and famous, not famous, but well-known in scholarly circles, most of them came from Germany or other countries in Europe and didn't speak English well. And she helped them with their classwork and helped them relate to their students and speak English back and forth. And among those professors was Louis Ginsburg. Louis Ginsburg was this brilliant professor of Talmud, and some of you may know this story about Henrietta Szold, but she fell madly in love. She's now in her early 40s. She fell madly in love with Louis Ginsburg. He was 13 years younger than she was, but she helped him. She worked very, very closely with him. She helped him with all his coursework. He came to really depend on her for translating works that he wrote, for editing works that he wrote, for editing and helping him with his class notes. He would spend 2-3 days a week having lunch or dinner with her in her home. On Shabbat, they would both go to the seminary synagogue, and then they would leave together. On Sundays, they would take walks together on Riverside Drive. He spent a great deal of time with her, and she then helped him with his great masterpiece,
which we also have here.
The Legends of the Jews, which started out as 1 volume and became 7 volumes.
So this is, oh, that's the wrong one.
You had it here.
It's this one. This is 1 of 7 volumes. She translated this from the German and edited it. I read something about her work at the Jewish Publication Society that they said that there was never a comma out of place. Like she was a meticulous editor. edited all of this, translated it, got it published, and took no credit for it.
No, at that time, took no credit. And took no credit for anything. She'd buy him things. He'd run out of tobacco. She'd get him new tobacco. He never paid her. But, they were these very good friends. And she was madly in love with him. But she knew that she was older than he was. And she said to herself, I can't, I have to keep this under control. If we just remain good friends forever, that's enough for me. But then his father died, and he felt guilty about a number of things in his relation to his father, and he poured out his heart to her about his feelings about his father. And she felt that there was a change in their relationship. She felt that now it didn't matter how old she was, that she saw what she thought was a love light in his eyes, and that now it was reciprocal. And she was sure something wonderful was going to happen. And he went off on vacation, as he often did in the summer, to Berlin. And when he came back, he came to see her. He said he'd like to speak to her alone. She told her she had an assistant to go in the other room. She thought he was going to propose marriage to her. And instead he said to her, "You will be happy to know I am engaged." He had met a younger woman in Berlin, and in a very hasty courtship, she had agreed, this young woman, who actually turned out to be a terrific woman, but very different than Henrietta. Her name was Adele, and she agreed to marry him. And he came to tell that to Henrietta, who, when she heard that news, almost passed out. She had to keep herself from fainting, and then went through all the right things, wrote a nice letter to Adele and so on, but went into a deep, deep depression as a result. But first, she and her mother, to protect her, to save her from that depression, suggested that they go to Europe together, and they did, but they also went to Palestine. It was still Ottoman Palestine at that time. And that was her first contact with Jews in Palestine, with the Zionism that she had adopted and loved. Now she saw the people who were building settlements, these Chovavei Zion people who were building settlements. But she and her mother went into the cities, and they saw the enormous poverty. They saw hospitals that were so run down. They saw children who were blinded because there were swarms of flies, flying into their eyes. They didn't even push them away anymore. They all had trachoma. And they saw all this terrible stuff there, along with the wonderful thing of these early pioneers. And when they came back, people felt she'd gotten past the Louis Ginsburg thing, and she got very busy, involved in everything she could be involved in the Kehillah in the city, in helping the Federation of American Zionists, which was a male Zionist organization, which was so messy. Their files were in such a mess, and she put them all in order and just did all of that. And then at one point she saw Louis Ginsburg and his wife, and that his wife was pregnant, and this set her back, and she really went into a very, very deep depression, in which she became blinded with no real cause, no medical cause. And it took a long time, but with great resilience, and Felicia loved this word, resilience, and it is resilience. She worked her way back. She worked her way out of that depression. And when she got over it, and when she began to see again, began to be herself again, she became a different person, a stronger woman, a woman who now saw a way for women to excel and to do other things in life, to become Zionists. And that's what, we'll get into that. Soon after that, she started Hadassah. So it was this saga of a woman beaten down, but with great inner strength, pulled herself back and became this great leader.
And after she has this period of like hysterical blindness, right? She goes to recover in Miami. She pulls herself back together and then never mentions him ever again. Is that right?
That's right. I never mentioned his name again. I actually got to know his granddaughter, who has been doing forever doing a documentary about Henrietta. I don't know where it stands at this point, but you know, the family kind of defends him, his granddaughter also. They say, well, there was never anything. If you read their letters, they used to write all the time to each other. That's what people did in those days. They wrote letters. They didn't have email. And if you read their letters, there's nothing personal in their letters. It's always Dr. Ginsburg and Ms. Szold. But so they say they were just very good friends. But everybody at the seminary saw them as a couple. Her mother saw them as a couple. And we women take Henrietta Szold's side and say he was a cad.
So she doesn't just pull herself together, but she goes on to found Hadassah.
Right.
With each of these stages of her life, you could say Dayenu. She goes on to found Hadassah, which not only changes the face of the Yishuv and then the state of Israel, but also transforms the lives of, what would you say, millions of American Jewish women?
I would say so.
Tell us about Hadassah.
Well, she decided, I mean, she had belonged to, there were these little Zionist groups, clubs sort of meeting, and she belonged to one of them, but she got the feeling, at first she didn't think there should be a women's organization, but once she saw that messy men's organization, she knew there was a place for women. So she got to thinking there needed to be a national Jewish women's organization. And so together with a few other women, they called a meeting, and it was February 1912, and they decided to form this organization. It's a complicated way the name Hadassah came, but at that time, they called it for one chapter, and then it became the national name. But it was, they met, and I don't know how many people know this, they met around Purim time. And the hero of Purim is, of course, Queen Esther. And Esther's actual Hebrew name, Esther is a Persian name, but Esther's Hebrew name is Hadassah. And so they decided to take that name, Hadassah, for their organization, which they did. And they began, her vision was that they would help support and do the health care, the need that she had seen in the cities when she was in Palestine, the need for good health care in the land of Israel, that they would form hospitals, that they began by getting 2 nurses to go over there, just nurses to start working with the people, and to start bringing health care to those big cities and to those hospitals that needed them. That was her vision that she really pushed the group to. They had many different ideas, but she pushed them to that idea, and that became the mission of Hadassah. And as you know, the Hadassah hospitals, of course, eventually grew out of all of that. And it was twofold. It was a twofold thing that happened. She worked like crazy, helping to start chapters for Hadassah. She went from city to city. She created the rules for them. There would not be 2 chapters in the same city competing with each other. There would be women from all walks of life in each chapter. There'd be women from Eastern Europe and more affluent women from America in each chapter. She worked very hard, and she started developing these chapters. And the women themselves were so taken with this that they themselves worked so hard and created an organization that the men became very jealous of. Hadassah chapters grew very quickly because there was nothing threatening about it, but the women found now their voices and skills that they didn't know. I mean, a woman might do a budget at home. She would now learn to how to do finances for the whole organization. These women who became Hadassah women were now women who had gone out in public speaking, but they learned to do that. They learned parliamentary procedure. they learned to speak, over time, they learned to speak to foreign leaders. Hadassah became a powerful organization, the most powerful Zionist organization, probably the largest of any women's organization, Jewish or not, in the United States. And for the women, it changed women's lives. And I feel so strongly about how fantastic. I don't know if there are Hadassah women here. Oh, there they are, some Hadassah women right there. Well, you should be very proud. And I know you are. Hadassah really, Hadassah did fantastic things for the Yishuv, for the Jews who lived in Palestine, but they did fantastic things for the women in America themselves, for the women themselves developing this organization, growing this organization, so much so that the men were always jealous of it. And the men saw themselves as, well, they're building up the land, they're doing settlements. What are the women doing? Healthcare? That's diaper Zionism, they called it, but they were so jealous. They tried to get control of the organization, and they did for a while, but the women got it back.
I mean, that's the Twitter version of decades of administrative maneuvering, first building this organization out of nothing. She would go and visit all the chapters as they were being created. So of course that's by train, and then like horse and buggy when she gets to a place, right?
That's right. She would schlep slides with her to show them.
Right, her slides from her trip to Palestine, which must have been glass slides,
those big fat
slide projector. I mean, just think of this, and she's nonstop.
And she every time there was a new chapter, she would go to welcome them and talk to them, and so she really inspired them. And then the work itself inspired them, and they saw that they were doing really important work that was changing the lives of people in Palestine and changing their own lives. I mean, I see her as a great, if you say pre-feminist or proto-feminist, or, you know, I mean, this was really doing something for millions of women's lives. And
I think that so many of the women, the story that we know is like, women were oppressed, and then feminism came along, and then they were free. But there were all of these kinds of organizations for even, you know, centuries, even different ways that women found power and their voice, and these, and how many, I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of women in Hadassah at the time.
All the time, yes. Yeah. And I always felt, you know, sometimes the daughters and granddaughters of Hadassah women feel sort of superior. Well, you know, they now have jobs, and you know, they get paid well and so on. Hadassah was volunteer work. Well, those volunteer women taught these. I mean, they were the examples. They were of how you open your mouth and speak out about something that you really care about. How did the younger women learn about it? They learned about it from the example that these women set. And I think they don't get enough credit for it, and they deserve all the credit in the world for it.
Agreed. Okay, so she goes to Palestine. We have to cut to the chase here because we're getting to the end, and her life is so long, we could be here for 80 years talking about it, but she's in Palestine for a long time. She's operating different Hadassah enterprises there. She's going back and forth. There's actually, very poignantly, she always says when she's in Palestine, she longs to be in America, and when she's in America, she longs to be in Palestine. She's there alone. Her whole family is back in the United States. One of the reasons why we know so much about her is that she's constantly writing letters, as Francine said. So letters to her sisters, letters to her mother, and all of these different people. So she's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. All of these administrative machinations about who's going to be in charge of Hadassah and what is her role going to be in the Yishuv. And there comes a point in 1930 where she's sort of out of a job, like an official job in the Yishuv. So she goes back to America because she's 70 years old at this point, right? And she says, if I'm going to be an old maid, I might as well be an old maid around my sisters, right? Around my family. She goes back to America, ready to just sort of live out the rest of her days there. And then what happens a year later?
Well, first she goes back and becomes head of she works with the Vod Leumi.
But it's not just that she goes back. David Ben-Gurion calls her back.
Yeah.
David Ben-Gurion, the Vaad Leumi is like the precursor to the Knesset. It's essentially the government of the Yishuv, the Jewish government. And he gives her a seat on the Labor Party ticket.
That's right.
Even though she's not a socialist, but he knows that she's a woman who gets stuff done. So he calls her back. She's 70 years old,
Right.
and then starts another unbelievable chapter of her life.
Then she becomes head of all social services for what was called the Vaad Leumi, which is the National Council of Free State Israel, essentially. And she started a social service. Earlier than, way back, she had started a nursing school. Now she started a social service school. She started a social service department in the government, in the Free State Israel government. And she started little social service departments in various places of the country. She really changed, earlier than that, she even changed the education system in Palestine. So she changed, she set up precedents for education and social services that to this day, they are the basis of what is used in the land of Israel. So that was a tremendously important thing that she did. But then what became, what she always considered her most important thing was the war was beginning, the Second World War was beginning, the Nazis were beginning to take over, and she became head of what we known as Youth Aliyah, which was rescuing it started with German children and moved on to later to the other countries of Europe, but of rescuing young German children, taking them out of their countries, resettling them in Palestine, and saving them in that sense. It was a very difficult thing at first to have their parents allow children to just leave and go to this strange land of Palestine that nobody knew very much about. But people could see the handwriting on the wall. She herself went to Berlin several times. I keep thinking that was a kind of dangerous thing she did. You know, she went as late as 1938. She was in Berlin, and she herself could have been who knows what. But she went and met with the parents of those children whose lives she was saving. Hundreds of parents would crowd around her, and she would tell them what they were doing and try to remember the names of each of the children. When the boatloads of children came to the United States, she would meet every boatload of children that came to the United States.
Palestine.
Pardon?
When the boats came to Palestine, she would meet them at the dock, right?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. When the boats came to Palestine, she would meet them at the dock and help them resettle them in the kibbutzim. They were all settled in regular kibbutzim or other kinds of settlements that were paid to have them, but they were settled. And she made sure that if there weren't enough beds in the kibbutz, the children got the beds. The kibbutz people had to go sleep wherever they slept in tents. But she watched over those children. They became her children. And as a matter of fact, after some time, they called her mother. They lost their parents, and they got to see her as their mother. And she also allowed them to speak German when they first came. In these kibbutzim, they were so adamant about children speaking Hebrew. She allowed them to speak German. She said, there's a great culture in Germany also. Try to remember that. Try to forget the bad stuff and remember the good stuff. And through Youth Aliyah, which eventually got to save not only German children, but children throughout Europe, they've saved thousands of children's lives.
I mean, and that's at the end of her life. So that's what she's doing until she's 85. And
then she dies at 85.
I'm going to ask you one more question, but just before that, if you have questions, just a reminder, you can put them on your note cards and pass them along, and we'll have time for a couple of questions. There's a part of your book that I just found so poignant, where you say, the people didn't realize, she wrote to her sisters, people didn't realize how little power she actually had. That's what she said. But that wasn't quite true, you say. Although she lacked political power, her name and her reputation carried power of their own that had opened doors for her over the years in America and Palestine. When she died in 1945, of course, there's a big state funeral. It's not a state, but as close as you get to a state funeral, including with a bunch of the British Mandate, leadership there, and thousands of people, which is just extraordinary to think of thousands of people in a funeral in Jerusalem in 1945. Several of the major institutions of the Yishuv put a statement in the paper. Oh, and this was also front page news, right? Across all the newspapers when she died. They said, from generation to generation, they will tell of Henrietta Szold, about a mother in Israel, the likes of whom has not risen through the ages. And 15 years later, David Ben-Gurion, who was prime minister, was dedicating, I think, a building in her honor, in her memory. And he called Henrietta not only the greatest woman that American Jewry has yet produced, but also undoubtedly one of the most noble personalities of our generation. Like, that's amazing. Francine, you, I feel like, have sort of, with your life's work, picked up in a lot of ways where Henrietta left off. Well, I mean, there's so many coincidences, and I'm sure that this is part of what drew you to her life, but not coincidences, similarities. You're so well educated Jewishly. You were involved with JTS, or a student at JTS, and involved with JTS for so long, involved in the conservative movement. And I think, I mean, we can't know, would she have been a feminist in the 1970s, but she was headed in that direction.
She was absolutely. I think she would have been a feminist in the 1970s.
A lot to say about women's education. When after her father died, no, who died second? Her
father died first.
Her father died first. So after her mother died.
Yeah, we ought to mention that because it's really a very famous thing. After her mother died, in the Orthodoxy still today, I think, and in those days, men would say Kaddish because women weren't counted in a minyan and didn't say Kaddish. And a family friend offered to say Kaddish for her mother. And she said, thank you very much. But women were freed from time-bound duties if they could not execute something, the mitzvah, women taking care of children or whatever. But if they could do this themselves, I'm sure that the law meant for them to do it themselves. And so I will say Kaddish myself for my mother. And this, I wish I could, I don't have the words, and it's all in the book. But these are words that are often quoted because this is definitely a feminist statement. And it's the first feminist, one of the first important feminist statements in Jewish life.
But deeply rooted in Jewish text. She didn't just make it up.
Yes, she didn't make it up, and a deeply knowledgeable woman. Right. I always respect women, particularly Jewish feminists, who are really deeply knowledgeable and can also be, feminists.
So tell us, you've studied in depth Henrietta Zold's life, Golda Meir's life. That book is a pretty solid tome.
Doorstop, as they say.
What inspires you to do this kind of work, to write about this?
I'm really fascinated by power and women in power. And women for so many years were powerless, but women had power in roundabout ways. The women in the Bible made powerful decisions. God said to Abraham, whatever Sarah says, do. But it was the men who were the center of things. And it always fascinated me how women did make things happen and did have power. But as time went on, these women in particular became very powerful. Golda Meir, I mean, unfortunately, we have not had another female prime minister in Israel, nor we don't know what will happen with the election. Have we until now had a female American president? But these women knew how to exert power. Now, Henrietta, Golda knew she was powerful. Mm-hmm. She didn't say I'm powerful, but she knew she could get what she wanted. Henrietta would say, I'm not, powerful, me, powerful, of course not, but she did. Her name itself, was so well respected that she put in an ad, as it were, in the papers against terrorism and signed her own name to it because she was so well respected. Her name carried so much weight. So I just find it fascinating to see the evolution of women and how women acquired power and still are struggling for that but are getting there. And I think it's just a wonderful subject.
I think it's also beautiful along these lines that you write a story that is not judging her life by our standards today, but by the standards of her time. And I'm sure the same is true with the Golda Meir book, which I haven't yet read, but that's my next one. And that, I think, is such a powerful lesson for us also in terms of how we understand history, that we have to understand the context in which people lived and judge their actions by that time.
Yes, you do. You do have to understand what you have to know what goes on. And you have to try to understand the people as a person. Is one of the things I tried to do in both books.
Okay, let's try to get just a couple of these. Ready? You've obviously studied Henrietta's life for a very long time. Did anything surprise you in your research for the book? Or are there elements of her life and legacy that carry new meaning today in this moment?
What was the last part of the question?
So first, anything surprise you? And then or you can answer, are there elements of her life and legacy that carry special meaning today, do you think, in this moment? Okay,
people always see what's surprised. What's always surprised me is how much I end up liking these people I write about it. I mean, I start out not knowing much, and then I think, wow, you're really terrific. I wouldn't say there's anything really surprised me because I knew a little bit beforehand. Well, I will. Okay, I'm going to be honest. Here's what really happened. I don't know if I should. Okay, here's what really happened. Go for it. Here's what really happened. So this series is the Jewish Life series, and I was asked to do this book on Henrietta Szold. And my first reaction was I was not going to. I said no. And I said no because, so this comes to what surprised me. I had always thought of her as sort of a goody-goody, this saintly woman. The books that have been written about her always portrayed her in this very saintly kind of way, this perfect woman. And I thought, that's very boring. I don't really want to write a book about a boring, saintly woman. But then I started doing a little research, and I found out she was a very complex person, and that interested me a lot more. So I'd say my surprise was how complex she was. She was complex in the sense that she never, just what Felicia had said at the beginning, she didn't seem to realize what a genius she was, even in administration. I mean, the kinds of things she did with the Men's Federation of American Zionists, the kinds of things she did, the organizational things she did, you have to be brilliant to be able to organize the way she organized. Now, she didn't see that she truly didn't see that as something very important. On the other hand, she didn't see that as creative, like her friends, who wrote books. But on the other hand, she wanted things done exactly her way. She didn't want, on one hand, she had no confidence in what she did. On the other hand, it had to be done her way because she knew she was always right. So I found that interesting combination of things, much more interesting than just a saintly person. She also had a bad temper, which I like to hear about. And the other part, the other half.
About her legacy or things that are important, you think, now after October 7th?
Yes, she was very concerned about the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in the land. She felt two things. One is that the Arabs, and she lived through Arab uprisings, and she felt that they had to understand that this land had to be shared with the Jews. On the other hand, she also felt that the Jews had to understand that at that time, the Arabs who worked, they didn't call them Palestinians then, the Arabs who worked in the land, worked the Jewish land. The Jews kind of looked down on them. They didn't see them as equals. And she felt that the Jews had to understand them more than they did. And I think, she felt that unless the Jews settled their problems with the Arabs, Zionism was never going to be what it needed to be. And we're seeing, we're still struggling with those issues today.
And she insisted that the healthcare institutions that she created in the Yishuv
for everybody.
Were for everybody.
Yes, the Hadassah Hospital to this day has doctors and nurses and patients who are Palestinians.
Okay, last question. What are you working on next? What are you working on next?
I'm not going to talk about it.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about something, but I'm not ready.
I think you got a couple big books left in you. Another golden
I don't know. You know what? I would. I have an idea for someone, but it would take forever. And unfortunately, I don't think I have enough years left to write another big book like that.
We are so blessed to be able to have this book with us. You know, I keep looking on the table at the mug that Gemma brought us with Emma Lazarus on it. She admired Emma Lazarus. They were contemporaries.
Yeah, she did.
Right?
I mean, she thought Emma Lazarus was the first Zionist. Emma Lazarus spoke about reselling people who were persecuted in the land of Israel.
So what a blessing to be able to spend an hour talking with an American Jewish hero about another American Jewish hero.
Thank you so much.
To wrap us up, Jess, to wrap us up, another American Jewish hero, Dina Pupko, Executive Director of Natan.
Just a couple remarks. My name is Dina Pupko, Executive Director of the Natan Fund. Thank you so much for such an enriching and incredible conversation. I learned so much. If you want to learn more, the book is on sale outside, and we encourage you to purchase a copy. And Francine will, God willing, make her way there soon, and we'll be able to sign the books that you purchased. And I just want to thank you all for being here tonight. And again, thank you for this wonderful book, and we are so honored to have honored it.
Thank you so much. I thank you for having me.